Viagra in a glass. Well,
White Tribe, Thursday at 9 on 4.
Get your brain trainers laced for 15 to 1, which starts 4's quiz hour at 4 after Great Estates.
The extravagant scale of Britain's great stately homes was originally designed to show off the power, influence and wealth of their owners. And here at Castle Howard, conceived by the Howard family in 1699, that need to impress extends to the furthermost limits of the grounds. Miles before you reach Castle Howard, you're greeted by huge monuments and gateways, deliberately placed to announce the grandeur of the estate. This is Karmaya Gate. It was built around 1730 and it's currently undergoing some restoration under the watchful eye of the Castle Howard architect. Peter Pace is responsible for overseeing all the restoration work at Castle Howard. He knows the estate very well. He's been coming here all his life.
Well, my father was the architect here, and he showed me a great deal without me consciously realising I was looking at architecture. But when I was a child, he often took me here, and I would not necessarily be shown the technicalities of what he was doing, but it would all be part of an interesting day. And I'm sure a great deal of it just rubbed off and made me what I am.
The Karmire Gate is a Grade 1 listed building, eligible for a grant from English Heritage. They have funded 40% of the £40,000 restoration cost, and their architect, Giles Proctor, has come to see how the work is progressing. Giles and Peter discover that on part of the wall, the wrong stone is being used.
Do you want that one replacing?
Yeah.
Take that one back
off. And then two, because the colour's going to take ages.
He's cut some more.
Has he? Oh dear. A lot of these are the original ones which have been rebedded and reclaimed from the ground, but occasionally where one has been lost, we've had to produce a new stone. Unfortunately, these few early stones that have gone on, they are not the stone we really want to use on this. You can't be here every day and you find things just go along a little faster than perhaps you would have wished. You know, as long as it's put right at the end, that's what counts. This build-up of lichen here, if you can try as much as you can to not brush it off, because actually some of these bigger pieces can take up to 50 years to establish.
Yeah,
it's
right,
quite a long process, and they'll eventually take over onto the new stone and will all help blend it in.
Yeah.
The gate was originally designed to accommodate horse-drawn carriages.
Unfortunately, there's a large quarry not far from Castle Howard, and big lorries do have to use that route because it's a very big detour. And we had just repaired the central gateway when literally a few days later a large lorry hit the arch and brought down some stonework. We have obviously talked to the highways with the intention of having the road restricted, but it is a complex problem. There are restrictions in the width, but most lorries can just get through by the skin of their teeth.
Agricultural income from around 20,000 acres paid for the construction of Castle Howard, so skilled groundsmen have always cared for the land. But ever since the 1700s, one particular pest has constantly plagued the estate: the mole. Moles damage crops and lawns, which is why the estate recruits a man who's probably Britain's most successful and experienced mole trapper. On his way to the Temple of the Four Winds is 61-year-old Brian Wald.
Now this is where they come along here, and then they come along the wall back, and then they work in front of the temple, and that's where their feeding ground is. And it's like sort of a main run, this, along the wall back here, just a bit further on.
Moles are recognised as agricultural pests. and the tools of the mole catcher's trade are his traps.
Well, it works like that, you see. And of course it goes in the run. And I'm not putting my finger in, but he comes along there and knocks it out. And that's it, you see. And it's pretty instantaneous.
At Castle Howard, controlling the mole population and keeping damage to a minimum is a priority.
Oh, it's making a terrible mess. And of course, longer the winter goes on, more he'll extend. He'll put another ear about tomorrow, but he would if I don't get him first. And I might not get him, like, you know.
The average mole can dig an 18-foot-long tunnel in just 1 hour and burrow through existing runs at a speed of 80 feet per minute.
His hands are just like ours, really, with a biggish finger in the middle. It's like a shovel, really, and of course it goes like that, you see. And when he's running along the run, it's just as if he's swimming, and so it can go pretty quick, really, almost as quick as you can walk. Well, he can go as quick as you can walk. Well, unless you're athletic, and then, of course, you might be a bit quicker, but otherwise, you just go like that, you see. And with the run being like it is, his feet are just right for going pretty quick, like.
Brian is one of the country's few remaining mole catchers, and the only one in Yorkshire to trap using traditional methods. It's a skill he learned 50 years ago.
When I first started mole catching, when I was about 11, I used to do the gardening at school. And then I did gardening at home, and then one morning I got up and this mole had run right down a row of peas, pushed them out. And so I went down to see this old mole catcher. He gave us a couple of traps, and I went home, and then I set them, and the next morning I had them all, and that's how I really got started.
Mole expert Brian and architect Peter Pace have one thing in common: long experience in their jobs. With Peter's architectural skills, you might expect his home to be a palace, but that's not yet quite the reality.
The architect was a man called G.T. Andrews, who was the architect for George Hudson, the great railway king. And he specialised in railway stations, a few churches, very few houses. Possibly G.T. Andrews forgot he was designing a rectory and rather thought it was a station. I don't know. The result is a house which had many shortcomings as a comfortable family home. Well, the house was requisitioned in the war, and this is some of the evidence still remaining. Obviously where the officers spent quite a time. And there's other doors in the house where various labels have been subsequently painted over, but in the right light you can actually read what was written there.
Peter recently bought the house and is fascinated by its history. He keeps items found during renovation, such as old wallpaper and newspapers.
One of them, The Guardian, was dated 1862, and there's reports from the American Civil War.
Peter lives here with his wife Ursula and their 2 children, Peter Jr. and Ina, both already showing signs of their father's talent.
They're very visually interested in man-made objects such as telegraph poles and electricity pylons. They become quite ecstatic about some of those, and one of our favourite walks ends up at the base of a very large pylon, and they stand underneath, and then they'll come back and draw it.
The family are living in a few rooms of the house whilst restoration continues. Ursula's a little uncertain about the project.
As long as it's not too long. As long as there's an end to it. Which there is light at the end of the tunnel. But it seems like a long tunnel sometimes.
It was an act of faith on her part to believe me, and there are times when I do finish a part of the house and she will say, "Oh, is that what it's going to be? Yes, that's much better than I thought it was going to be."
No one in the family expects the house to be finished for at least 3 years. Despite having worked at Castle Howard for the past 6 years, there are still corners of the estate that Peter doesn't know about. He's just discovered that the Temple of the Four Winds has an underground vault, which he's going to see for the first time.
I'm amazed. I always thought there would be a basement, but nothing which was accessible. I'm sure most people who knew about it assumed everybody else knew about it, so it was more a question of I didn't ask because I didn't know it existed, and they didn't tell me because they didn't realise I didn't know. There's a new dimension to the Temple of the Four Winds. It's a very exciting building as it is, and it has become even more.
Castle Howard is fighting a continuing campaign against moles. For head groundsman Brian Deaton, one good mole catcher makes all the difference.
Yeah, well, Mr. Howard's pleased you're getting on top
Oh,
of him anyway.
that's good. Right, that's good.
Too much brownness showing, not enough green. Occasionally you'll get these messages, I've got some merlils from Mr. Howard, but I always try and be one jump ahead. You know, if I see some, I get Brian in straight away, you know. Brian's 1 in a million, a real character, and he's got such a lot of country crafts. And one of his crafts is catching moles, you know. We tried catching him ourselves, but Brian just seems to have the knack. He's got the gift of catching them, really.
Now this one here isn't quite so deep, you see. It's a little bit more shallow, that, so we can put the smaller trap in. But the trick is to know where to put these in the first place.
Mole catchers have always been highly regarded by landowners. Castle Howard's accounts from 1796 show a mole catcher's fee as £5 a year. On many estates, tenants were charged extra rent to pay for a mole trapper's services.
Well, this is early 1800s trap, this one. The mole used to go in and put his feet in, and of course his body, and then it used to just jam him in, and he couldn't reverse out, and so that was it really. But it was a bit cruel because he obviously was starved to death, perhaps. This one's a Victorian one, and he came along and then he knocked that out. Well, he knocked that out like that, and then it flew up, you see. And he would have been in this end, presumably, and he would have killed him almost instantly. In fact, that was one of the... it's quite as good as the modern trap, really. These two are sort of about 1910, round there. And it's quite as good, that one's as good as the day it was made. And then, of course, these two are just the modern ones, which we use as, you know, from day to day, as it were.
Brian's convinced that traps are the most humane way to do his job, a method tried and tested through the ages. But even here, new technology is creeping in.
Hello? Oh, I must have pressed. Hello? It is? Yeah, and whereabouts in Slingsby?
Because many landowners are still reluctant to use modern-day poisons, Brian is as much in demand today as his forebears were. Yet mole trapping could soon be a thing of the past.
I think my traditional role, yes, I think it will die out eventually, yeah. Probably happen in my lifetime, that I would think. Because I don't, there doesn't seem to be anybody interested in trapping at all. I had a youth trainer, but he only lasted about 3 days, and then his hands got a bit cold, and that did him. He didn't come back anymore.
When the plans for Castle Howard were laid down in the late 17th century, both the 3rd Earl of Carlisle and his architect Vanbrugh were keen to make sure that the grounds were just as impressive as the house itself. Landscaping started early on, and even today a great deal of work is spent on maintaining the grounds and the gardens.
So if we crack on with these tops, get them as level as possible. If there's any dips, just level them out. Yeah. You know, don't cut down to the lowest point, cut to the highest point.
Today, head groundsman Brian Deaton and his team are starting one of the biggest tasks of the year, clipping the yew hedges. It's a long job.
We start it and you think, oh well, yeah, we're on here for at least, 3 weeks, cutting hedges sort of virtually non-stop, and we've still got other jobs to pull in as well. Lawn mowing and weeding beds and that, it doesn't stop, but this job has to be fitted in, unfortunately. Zucchus hedges sometimes.
The area the lads are working on lies in front of the south side of the house and is known as the south parterre. The design of this formal garden has radically changed several times in its 300-year history. Those designs have been studied by garden guide Lynn Hawthorne.
Work began on the south parterre in 1721, but I don't think you can fix a date because it's almost certain that it would have been years in planning. In the early years, it was described as a forest of obelisks and the obelisks were capped with gilded swans and urns.
This is how the south parterre looked when it was first laid out in front of the house. Several of the classical statues which once decorated the lawns still exist within the grounds. But garden fashions constantly change, so in the early 1850s, this elaborate Victorian design replaced the original. By now, 30 skilled gardeners were essential for the upkeep. The garden's current style came some 50 years later in the late 1800s. It was created by Rosalind, the 9th Countess of Carlisle. She was so keen to impose her own style on the gardens that she even braved a snowstorm to supervise the work.
It's very nice, it's very grand. I think it's what you would expect for a house of this size. I couldn't contemplate having this in my own backyard.
Inside the house, responsibility for the cleaning, tidying and polishing of all the public rooms lies with caretaker Dennis Wilson and his wife Dorothy.
It's more than a job, it is a way of life, living here. I don't know how to put it, actually. You come in through the doors and the house takes over. It's your whole life. And you go around other places, other stately homes, and you think, not as good as ours.
The Wilsons have a team of just 4 cleaners to keep 25 rooms, 200 Roman busts and 3 miles of corridors spick and span. Later today, Dennis will be meeting with Simon Howard to discuss plans for the biggest job of the year, the spring cleaning of each room, that perversely takes place in the winter. But first, he's on his daily rounds to check that everything's in place for when the house opens to the public at 11 a.m.
Straight away I can see the bronzes have been moved on the table. Mr. Howard and I place these in position beginning of the year, and always we find that they're being fiddled with. The guide showed them to the tourists, and there's a set place for every one, in lines that way. And he does like facing forward. Mr. Howard does notice if things are moved. He likes things in a place where he knows what they're doing. Where we can go into a room and we look around and we know by the position of things if they're missing. In the past there would be a butler and a housekeeper combined, and they would do the job as Dorothy and I do now. Servants were very frightened of the butler and the housekeeper. They were the rulers of the castle. But nowadays they tend to be free and easy. Not so bad with us now.
One tradition does remain, that of generations of the Wilson family working for the Howards. 2 of Dennis's and Dorothy's daughters and their husbands work here. Dorothy's cousin Gwen is employed in the private wing. The eldest grandchildren have summer jobs in catering, and the younger kids are often around, maybe sizing up career opportunities for the future.
Mrs. Howard did once say to us, it looks as if it's going to be Castle Wilson and not Castle Howard.
What? Well, you do get used to people walking past the windows and looking in at you, but you give them a wave of the hand and a smile.
I think they probably do think that we're Mr. and Mrs. Howard sometimes. But I think they get a bit of a shock to think that there is somebody there, really.
Back by the yew hedges, work is well underway. The most difficult thing is getting the hedges straight.
When I first started about 13 years ago, all the edges were just cut by eye, even the tops. And then one year after they'd been cut, Mr. Howard came out and said, no, that won't do. I want them all level and straight way through. So originally started doing them with bamboo canes, but that didn't work very well because you couldn't get a very tight line. And then we went
we ended up on these metal ones because we get the flexibility as well as the strength. It's a lot easier to do. That's about spot on, is that? If we can get it set up like that, that'll be okay. Yeah.
Clipping the hedges is an annual job, and the gardeners use petrol cutters. But in the past, such labour-saving devices were unheard of.
You should imagine we used to use hedge shears, which I wouldn't like to think I was looking at nearly 1.5 miles, 2 miles of hedges, cutting it with some edging shears, because I don't think my muscles would last that long.
It's 2 o'clock and time for Dennis's meeting with Simon Howard. In the winter, the house is closed to the public, and all the state bedrooms are used as guest rooms for private parties. But this year there's a problem. The first visitors will arrive just 48 hours after the house closes for the season. Dennis and his team will have to work overtime to make preparations.
And we'll need all those bedrooms on the other side ready.
Yes, now there we're going to have to do those on a night. Worked it out with the girls. We're going to start probably the last week in October.
Right, okay.
And then I'll have the doors put on the 1st of November.
Right. So will you make up the beds and have all of that ready to roll?
We'll start everything.
We just need to keep on top of it, that's all, isn't it?
In October.
Once the meeting's over, Dennis is free to carry on with his chores. The biggest job of the day is polishing every single wooden floorboard, a walk of 3.5 miles.
The floorboards are what they call shipboarding, and when they had the wooden men of war, the ships, the captains, if they ran aground or were in a battle, they could come to a stately home and claim so many feet of board, and that's why the boards are all a different size and width, so that they correspond to the man of war.
Back at the Temple of the Four Winds, Peter Pace is descending to the vaults for the first time to see if any restoration work is required.
I've always assumed there would be a space underneath here, but not an interesting walkable in space. It would just be a sub basement. But this is very exciting to see it as a piece of architecture. So I'm thrilled to see this.
It's actually remarkably dry. I mean, apart from the obvious signs that water's been seeping through the white patches there, but you know, it's pretty.
Yes, some loose mortar, but otherwise everything seems to be very well consolidated. This benching, it's part of the thickening of the wall at the base, but it does seem to have a very intentional finish to it to act as seating. I've not seen anything like it before. It could well have been used by people preparing picnics, having a space for the servants to go to so they wouldn't be hanging around in the landscape. It's nice to think it might have been a place for clandestine meetings.
His examination over, Peter returns to the surface, confident that down there at least no major work is needed. I'll be at Castle Howard again tomorrow when gardener Mark Franklin is in a tight spot under the Atlas Fountain. Sculptor Michael Major has the job of recreating an unusual statue from scratch. And we meet gardener Linda Gibson, who's responsible for growing flowers for more than 500 displays.